Well, welcome back this week. You know, what we try and do is build understanding about what is going on and such in the news or in political situations and that sort of thing. Today I'm going to get a little bit of a departure and show you some history. Now, why do we study history? Well, we study history really to study human nature, how things evolve, how things happen, to forearm us about what's happening to us today and on into the future. Now, usually that's not brought out in your history lessons. They say history repeats itself. No, history doesn't repeat itself. Human nature continues the way it's always been, as well as the nature of government. In your study of history, if you study human nature and the nature of government, which is really what history is all about, then you will begin to understand what's happening around you today. You may have increased technology, the uniforms may be different, whatever. But human nature and the nature of government never changes. Now, one of the things that the enemies of freedom like to do is to eliminate their enemies. And so what they will try and do is divide and conquer. Very well understood technique, but a lot of people don't notice it when it is being implemented. One of the things today that we're seeing in the way of dividing and conquering is the conservative movement. Now, I won't get into the various things that they're using right now to do that. I'll save that for a future segment. But I just want to show you the history of the attacks on the John Birch Society to try and isolate us from the rest of the world, because we've always had tremendous influence in the conservative and constitutionalist movement. In fact, in many ways, you can document the fact that these movements have as its embryo the John Birch Society. It may not be entirely direct, it may be philosophical, in some cases it is direct, but they know if they can eliminate the nub, the hub, and the wellspring, if you will, of the conservative movement, they can divide it and conquer it. Back in the 60s, for instance, here was a publication put out by the AFL-CIO Committee on Education, on Political Education, called COPE, Committee on Political Education, and it was all about the extremists. Well, as it turns out, the extremists happen to be the John Birch Society, and oh, aren't they terrible? And they're enemies of freedom, and so on and so forth. Another organization came on about the same time called the Institute for American Democracy, and they had a whole publication on the John Birch Society. And here is a little chart that they had. I blew it up so you could see it better, purporting to show that the John Birch Society was the hub of all the conservative and anti-communist movements in the United States. Some of this is true, some of it is just plain influence. Some of them we didn't have any connection with at all. We didn't want any connection with them. But at any rate, the Institute for American Democracy came out with a long list of sponsors in blue here on the sides of the pages, which was basically the overview of the leftist and internationalist community in the United States against the John Birch Society. Well, of course, it started as well into the Republican Party, because the Republican Party didn't like the influence that John Birch Society members, not the organization, but the members had within the Republican Party, that really provided, if not the most, a great deal of the impetus for the nomination of Barry Goldwater for president in 1964. And the establishment Republicans didn't want that to happen again. They wanted to run their candidates. And so they did everything they could to purge the John Birch Society members out of any leadership within the Republican Party. Articles like this, where I lived at the time in Seattle, GOP house cleaning, how they're getting rid of Republicans who happen to be members of the John Birch Society and isolating them. They even came out with a pamphlet, The Challenge for Responsible Conservatives. Responsible conservatives really were led by the left within the Republican Party, the internationalists. The people had no problems with welfare. Today we call them neocons and that sort of thing. Even the Washington State Democratic Committee came out with a pamphlet, Inside the Far Right. And these things were all designed to isolate the John Birch Society from the rest of the movement, to negate any influence we had. And I'll show you why in just a moment. We even had the Attorney General of the state of Washington going to a rally to try and get rid of the ROTC off the University of Washington campus, organized by the left, Republican. The young Republicans, the moderates, swept the elections for the young Republicans at the time, with the idea that, of course, we need to get people that we can elect as candidates and that sort of thing, to appeal to the voter. Instead of trying to move the voter, instead of trying to put forward constitutionalists, they were only concerned about being elected. That's fine. That's what you're supposed to do as a politician. But what can you do if you promise this to get elected, and then in the back of your mind you're going to do something else? Now, the left does that and gets away with it, but the right in politics can't get away with it because their constituency is totally different. The constituency of a conservative and a constitutionalist demands honesty, demands morality, demands adhering to the Constitution of the United States. And so they're not going to get behind someone that doesn't have that out in front and live up to it, that sort of thing. The reason that they didn't want the Birchers in the Republican Party was not just our influence on certain issues and that sort of thing, but the fact that we've always named names. In other words, when we say something about what's going on, we tell you not just the issue itself and the philosophical base, right or wrong, but who's behind it, why they're behind it, what other organizations and movements are they involved in. Wouldn't you think that that has something to do with this issue as well? Here, for instance, was a fellow that ran as a Republican in Washington State for the legislature. And those of us who were involved said that this guy was not what he professed to be. But he ran as a Republican. And all the Republican establishment was falling all over themselves because they had a man of color running as a Republican. So they had to get behind him. Well, this is a copy of this great Republican's mugshot for being arrested more than once. And he was a man that was involved in communist-led organizations like the black student organizations of the day, affiliated with the Black Panther Party and everything else. There was even a letter sent to him, and I have a copy of this letter sent to this candidate, being endorsed by the biggest, most notorious communist lawyer in the city of Seattle. Here's a copy of a picture of this communist attorney haranguing an inquest in the city of Seattle because a policeman shot a young man who just happened to try and blow up something with some dynamite. We used to have terrorism in Seattle at that time, explosions all the time. That sort of thing, bombings going on. You think it's a modern phenomenon. It used to be in the United States almost a daily thing with bombings and such. For those of you who have been born since those days, you have no recollection of it. For those of you who are even alive in those days, time has erased these things from your memory. But here, for instance, is even Michael Ross's letter thanking John Coughlin for his letter of endorsement. Don't ask me how I get these things. At any rate, Michael Ross gets elected to the legislature of the state of Washington, and you couldn't find any difference between him and the Democrats. In fact, he was even more left than the Democrats were. But he was a Republican, right? This is the kind of thing that the establishment Republicans got behind, the kind of candidate they got behind, because the American people had no idea of the background of these people, and they didn't want that pesky John Birch Society telling people the truth about folks. One of the other things, by the way, the Institute for American Democracy came out with was Birchers already besmirching Nixon. We told people from the onset what was wrong with Richard Nixon, but people didn't listen because they had drove this wedge between us and other Republicans. And now we see the history of Richard Nixon. It's not pretty. There are a lot of things about Richard Nixon that were very bad. I used to give speeches on the man that would get people so angry over what they had missed in regards to this man, it was pathetic. He was absolutely trying to remake the United States into an image, something different than that laid down by the Constitution. They even said we were taking over the PTA. Well, we tried to tell them we didn't want it. And that's a parent-teachers organization. And that was during the Motor Eid fight, when we were trying to fight sex education in the schools. Another issue that needs a little bit more background to it. We can't get into it today. And its influence on the minds and the psychology of the youth and the harm that it does to them, both later in life in their marriages and everything else. But at any rate, that's a little history to show that wedge that was driven between the Birch Society and the Republicans, just like they're doing today between the Birch Society and the Tea Parties and others, trying to separate us, trying to divide and conquer. People should listen sometimes to what we have to say. They don't always have to agree with us, but please listen. You might find something very interesting. Till next week, we'll see you then.